Hello listeners, and welcome to Plugged In, the energy news podcast from Montel. Each week we bring you in-depth analysis and insights from across the energy sector. This week I'm in Germany at the eWorld Trade Fair that's brought close to 1,000 companies in the energy sector, institutions and associations together under one roof. My focus this week is on the rise of populism in Europe and beyond, and the impact it's having on the energy sector and energy markets. After decades of integration and liberalisation in Europe, could the wholesale energy markets be at risk? Norway is a classic case in point, a government breaking up over the adoption of EU energy laws. Elections loom for Germany on the 23rd of February and for Norway in September, with the politicisation of the energy transition at the heart of the debate. Before we go into the heart of the matter, I spoke to Siobhan, Montel's Brussels correspondent. A warm welcome, Siobhan.
Hi, Richard.
So what's occurring in the nub of EU policy making? You know, what in particular, I'm interested in what steps the European Commission is taking to avoid a backlash against energy markets, or what appear to be potential failures in the energy markets themselves.
Yes, so it's a very interesting time in energy policy because, like you say, there have been issues about prices and how the markets are integrated, and this is something that is causing problems in certain countries. So we're at an interesting time because we're at the beginning of a 5-year cycle of policy. And what the European Commission has been saying is that it is sensitive to these concerns about prices, energy market prices, and one of its priorities for the next 5 years will be looking at ways to bring down prices for households, but also for industrial sectors to help them be more competitive with the outside world.
Thank you very much indeed, Sean. My guests alongside me here in Essen are Hanns Koenig, Managing Director, Central Europe at Aurora Energy Research. A warm welcome to you, Hanns.
Thanks a lot for having me again.
Yep. And Amund Vik, who was Deputy Minister in the Norwegian Ministry of Petroleum and Energy from 2021 to 2023 and is now Senior Advisor to Eurasia Group, focusing on Europe's energy transition and European geopolitics. A warm welcome to you, Amund. Welcome back to the pod.
Thank you.
Before we dive into discussion, I had a chat with Stephen Woodhouse, Director at AFRY and an expert on changing energy markets and the energy transition. We chatted about the concerns of a rising tide of populism in European energy markets. Stephen Woodhouse, a warm welcome to the Plugged In podcast.
Richard, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
We're here at eWorld, the meeting place of the energy sector in Europe, so that explains the sort of hubbub, the buzz in the background. We're only just getting going now, but I'm here to talk to you, Stephen, about a wave of populism that seems to be sweeping certain countries in Europe, and potentially a backlash against the energy transition. Should we be concerned?
I think yes. So I'm a naturally optimistic person, but my faith in the future has been diminished somewhat. Well, going back to 2016, there was a couple of particular events in 2016 which dented my faith. I live in the West Midlands. I go to the Hay Festival in Britain every year, and it restores my faith in humanity for a short period. But it's an increasingly short period that my faith is restored. I think we should be very worried about this. I'm a technocrat, which is kind of the opposite to a populist. And technocratic solutions and populist solutions are almost the complete opposite. So populist solutions tend to be conservative with a small c, if not a big C. They tend to be localized. They tend to be short-termist.
And often very simple.
And simplistic. Simplistic. Technocrat solutions tend to be multi-layered complex. They tend to be global or multi-regional in their nature, and they tend to be long-term. And they're about paying today for long-term broad benefits in the future. And climate change is the ultimate externality, where the actions of one individual region or nation or group of people on its own makes no difference but it's a global problem. So it's incredibly difficult to get solutions to these, in economics terms, externalities without global agreements. And we see those global agreements breaking down.
Absolutely. It is very much a worry. And we're here in Germany where, now the AfD, the country's second biggest party, if the polls are to be believed, is calling for windmills or wind turbines to be torn down. And do you think this is also a worrying development, that there is a backlash against the energy transition in countries such as Germany, which has been a leader, if you like, and certainly in wind power?
And Britain as well. So, there'd been a backlash against onshore wind in England and Wales since before we even had any onshore wind to speak of in England and Wales. We're just about to change the planning policy in Britain to enable infrastructure, but the anger of the lobby groups and the voice that these lobby groups seems to have in either social media or real media is becoming amplified. So it's the ultimate, somebody locally faces a consequence for the wider benefit, and they're not prepared to do so, and they get a very loud voice.
Yep. I mean, I think at core as well is sort of in Scandinavia, suddenly friendly neighbours are talking about not renewing interconnectors or cutting off exports to their fellow Scandinavians. And this is quite a new development in many ways. And isn't there a sense that, we're faced with a very uncertain, unpredictable world at the moment, geopolitically? Isn't there a case for saying we should be more connected rather than less connected?
Absolutely. With the renewable-led system that we're building, interconnection is a vital part of that. But there are so many fractures in that. I've been with the company I work for now, A3. They were a different company name when I joined, a small group of 30 people in the UK. But one of the first projects I worked for was on the North Sea interconnector from Norway to the UK, which got abandoned on political grounds because the Norwegians didn't want to raise their prices. So some of this isn't new. That was more than 20 years ago. But we're about, on 1st of January 2026, if nothing changes, to introduce something like a €45 per megawatt hour tax on all imports to the EU from third countries, including Britain. So that will cause havoc with the way our interconnectors operate and with the development plans of the next round of interconnectors.
Is this the carbon border adjustment mechanism?
Carbon border adjustment mechanism.
So what kind of consequences could that have, do you think, for the interconnectors?
It will drag back our development of interconnectors by years. It will collapse the price in Britain and probably in Ireland, because neither country will be able to export its surplus wind to the continent with a €45 tax per megawatt hour. So the consequences of that on the integrity of our European trading system are awful. The consequences of Brexit on the idea of developing a North Sea hub for hybrid interconnectors and wind connections has already been incredibly damaging. So at some level, these kind of concerns have been going on for many, many years, but it's becoming visceral. The backlash against the move towards electric vehicles is another example. The petrol heads who are simply up in arms about the idea that their favourite Jaguars with petrol engines won't be available anymore. The power that these lobby groups had is quite incredible.
No, absolutely, Stephen. And I think, and what we're also seeing, in Norway is a government imposing fixed retail price at a certain level. I mean, what kind of impact or repercussions could that have?
So
I know that you may not be, it's not your core home market.
No, but I've been looking at that a little bit, not at any of the detail, but we talk blithely about the electrification of our world and the decarbonisation of the power sector leading to the electrification, which then leads us to decarbonisation of our entire economies. And two of the most important steps in that are the electrification of transport and the electrification of heat. And we often talk about those in one breath as if they're similar. They're actually incredibly different. With the advent of renewables, we've done studies, the times of system peak, system tightness, on average in Britain today, it's around 4 hours. By 2035, 2040, in a decarbonised power system, it's more like 40 hours. So the type of flexibility that you need to bring to the system in a highly renewable world is the German Dunkelflaute, the calm still period, cold, calm still.
So this is 4 hours a year from 4 to 40?
For the average duration of a scarcity event. So it's not about the frequency, but the average duration of one of the... So the things that you design your capacity payment mechanism, if you have one, for, moves from a 4-hour to a 40-hour problem. You can imagine a battery can make a reasonable contribution to a 4-hour problem. It makes an almost insignificant contribution to a 40-hour problem. So batteries are not the solution to renewables intermittency. We need longer-term flexibility solutions. Electric heating does not have that multi-day window of flexibility. It can do short-term stuff, but if you replace conventional gas boilers with heat pumps, you can be flexible for a short period of time, but not a long period of time. And when it's really cold, the heat pumps kick into a different mode and the consumption goes up. Transport is hugely, hugely flexible. I've got an EV, I do the average number of miles a year. I need 10 hours a year charging, 10 hours a week charging, that's it, anytime. So I can be part of the 4-day problem. With vehicle to grid, we're currently doing a study for the UK government on vehicle to grid. With vehicle to grid, you can be an even bigger part of the solution. But all of that requires the customer, the domestic car driver, to have some kind of access to a real-time price. And if you slap in a flat tariff and a minimum floor, Norway, which is the world's most advanced country for electric transport and electric vehicles, and by the way, nearly 99% rollout of smart meters and lots of customers on dynamic tariffs, we risk killing it in the leading market for all of this to show that it works.
Absolutely, and I have an EV and I have solar panels. I might as well just bin the solar panels now because the state's going to fund my electricity costs. Yeah. No, it's.
Let me tell you an unrepeatable story, but you'll probably repeat it. I did a fantastic project a few years ago for Fortum, who said, please could you investigate the behavior of the 4 Nordic TSOs who have agreed that their decisions will be in the Nordic interest, not in the national interest. Could you please investigate the extent to which that's true? And we concluded that in operational terms that was generally true, but in investment terms it was very much not true. They were very much looking at their national interest for investments. But along the way I went to visit the RSC in Copenhagen. On the desk, as I walked in, they don't have a reception, they don't have visitors, but they had the Xenophobes Guide to the Swedes, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Finns, and the Germans. And the Danish guy, he said, people think of the Nordic nations as being a kind of a cohesive group that thinks like. He said, it's not like that at all. He said, the Norwegians, well, farmers who found oil. He said, we Danes, we're the original Vikings and pirates. You count your fingers after you shake hands with a Dane. He said, the Finns, well, they look east as well as they look west. We don't quite know what they're thinking. And he said, and nobody likes the Swedes. which I take like nobody in the British Isles likes the English because we're the biggest nation in that. I take it to mean that. But,
but I think, you've touched on something here because it's often put forward as the epitome of regional cooperation, but at the core of it, it won't take much. If people start cutting exports or cutting cables or putting in place a fixed retail tariff, these have reverberations across the whole regional market, do they not, Stephen?
Like a marriage, you have to work at cohesion. You cannot just take it for granted because there are always shortcuts you could make that look like a good idea at the time but make a lot of damage to the cohesive agreement that you have. And in a benevolent world, those small things don't matter. But when it gets tight, if you've lost your cohesion, you will regret it a lot later on.
And it doesn't take much of these sort of unilateral decisions or policies put in place without calculating what it does mean, what it means for neighbours or for the country at large.
The thing about populist solutions, though, is that because they're simplistic and short-term, they don't deliver the outcomes that people want in the long term, but we've got a very limited window to get people on board with the solutions to climate change. And we can't afford to lose 10 years in this. We've been trying to keep average temperatures below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We spent more than 12 months above that. And I know it's an average over 10 years or something, so we technically couldn't reach that for 10 years, but we already have. January was 0.2 degrees higher than the general expectations. I don't think we have time for a 10-year populist interlude. And by the way, I don't see this. You talked in the sort of pre-discussion about it being kind of swings and pendulums. That's not my perception of how populism works. It's a gradual downward slide until something catastrophic happens and you rebuild the world afterwards. I don't see a steady way back out of this. It's a slippery slope, and you end up in a pit.
Stephen, thank you very much for being a guest on Plugged In, the Energy News podcast. Thank you. I'd like to start really maybe by focusing on Norway, Amund. It was quite a surprise move almost 2 weeks ago when the government announced a fixed retail price at 40 øre a kilowatt hour, which is close to around 34 euros per megawatt hour, I think. What was the view? What was the reason for that, do you think?
Well, that's a great question. I think the last couple of weeks in Norwegian politics have been very intense. A lot of things has been happening. As you introduced the podcast with, starting this month, we had a two-party minority government. And then after a bit of back and forth, the minority party in that government left government in protest against joining into 3 EU directives from 2018-2019 on the energy market integration. And as part of the breakup, the Labour Party that I belong to also launched this Norway price thing, which is, as you say, 40 øre per kilowatt hour fixed price, which has been very popular. But of course, it's been criticized from all directions, really. But voters seems to like it.
Voters seem to like it, and it's got broad political support as well, hasn't it not?
Yes, or I think it's got broad political support to the sense that no one in politics want to criticize having low energy prices. And I think that the fact that it comes from the Labour Party gives it some more credibility than if it came from one of the smaller fringe parties who habitually say the government should intervene in the energy market. I do think it does a few valuable things, right? It takes the pressure out of the electricity price debate, which I think is good for maintaining the system as a whole over time. It's good, I think, that it doesn't involve government intervention in the wholesale market. But then again, it also removes the price signals completely on the end user side, which is some of the commentators have kind of pointed to as it's not the greatest thing to do in a purely hydro-based system like the Norwegian. But then again, the emergency compensation scheme during the energy crisis as well basically kept the prices at 90 øre per megawatt hour, 70 øre per megawatt hour.
So this is another move, but it does very little to basically provide consumers of electricity with the price signals to lower demand when it's most needed in the system, when it's very cold, when it's dark and cold, for example.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And sort of I've worked with Nordic electricity market design for most of my career, and for me, it's a little bit like nails on the blackboard, sort of doing this kind of move. But also, I think it's important for us, especially here in this environment, to recognize that there's a trust that needs to be in the system between the consumers, the regulators, and the power companies, and the people who sell the power. And I think over the last couple of years, with increased volatility, price spikes, very high prices, and in a country like Norway, where the we're used to having very low electricity prices, and people have built sort of their lifestyles around it with electric heating, with big houses that require a lot of electricity consumption. When prices of electricity skyrocket or start to be very volatile, I think you have to find a balance between what's the correct regulatory move from a pure market design perspective and what is needed to maintain sort of the system components that are most important. Right? And I think if you look at Norway, European system, the most important thing is to preserve the wholesale piece of the market. And then I think you can accept some compromise on the retail side as long as you find some manageable ways around.
But in a sense, I mean, the government is then subsidizing people with large houses or have cabins in the mountains and there's jacuzzis, is paying for their power. And as the water reservoirs, wear down, come down, then, you get to a point where you ask, is that really the most sensible solution?
Well, this is one of those times that it's a good feeling to not be in the government or represent the government. I feel very liberated talking about this. But I do think, and the government's been pretty light on a detail on how this is to be implemented, but I do think you have to pair it with some measure of demand control to maintain power supply in times of stress. And I think that would be important, not least for the Swedes and the other participants in a sort of synchronous market where if the Norwegians just keep on powering down when there's little hydro capacity in Norway or Sweden, I think that could be difficult. But also I don't think that the absence of information is necessarily to be interpreted like the government hasn't thought of that or won't, because it will be rolled out in October, so they still have some time. But I am very curious to see how they will plan to pull that out.
What the details
because demand response, if you're not doing it during, there needs to be some mechanism to make sure that the consumers reduce their demand. So I think two things will happen. One, I think the bigger consumers will play a much larger role in sort of demand response in the system. So professional consumers, big industry, people who have a lot of demand to swing, I think will be more important. But also I think there needs to be some kind of mechanism. But those typically aren't very popular. So if you're not using it via the price, you have to use some form of regulation to make it happen. So I guess it remains to be seen what they choose.
I mean, in a sense, I feel quite sorry for those companies trying to sell heat pumps and solar panels, because if the state is guaranteeing a certain price, then why bother?
Well,
that's maybe a cynical approach there, Amund.
I don't think that's cynical, but I do think that I occasionally, also with the sort of emergency compensation scheme, I tend to think that some of the commentators from the market perspective underestimate the sheer force that this has hit the Norwegian consumers and voters with the power prices over the last couple of years. And I think there's a tendency to underestimate the need to have some form of public trust in the system. So Norway's been one of the first countries to fully liberalize the markets in the early 90s. And I think from then until now, this has been a major success story with lower prices year by year, increased efficiency. But these last couple of years have been difficult. And I think there needs to be some level of compromise. Whether this will turn out to be the correct move, I think it's early to say. But I don't think it's cynical to say what about the heat pump manufacturers, but also I think we need to do some measure of action to maintain system integrity.
And then the trust in the market, or the trust in the companies. Hanns, Germany's it's got an election looming, in just a couple of weeks. Has there been a call for the similar kind of price movements here in the retail sector? Certainly for the industrial sector, hasn't there? Could you enlighten us a little bit about what the level of the debate is in Germany at the moment?
Exactly. So I think the debate in Germany has been going on for probably ever since the energy crisis, really. But it's been more centered around industry, where there is a feeling that energy-intensive or power-intensive industry in particular is struggling to remain competitive, especially compared to the US, where, of course, not only you didn't have an energy crisis, but you also have fracking and extremely cheap and natural gas, which translates into low gas prices and low power prices. And that has been a big topic for debate over the past couple of years. However, I don't see any very concrete proposals on the table that would alter with the functioning of all the passing along of the wholesale market signal. It's rather than being about continuing grid-free rebates, abolishing taxes, abolishing the renewables levy and making that tax funded. So the past government has done a lot on that, but they haven't subsidized either consumer or industrial tariffs in a way now that the Norwegian government is proposing to do. However, just to provide a bit of perspective on this fixed tariff thing, I do think that is a pan-European phenomenon in a way, because out of the European response to the energy crisis came a right to a fixed tariff, which has been encoded into the Electricity Market Directive, and which every European consumer will have a right to. It won't necessarily be a subsidized fixed price, such as in Norway, but it will be a fixed price. And I think even that already is actually quite problematic, because you're losing a lot of savings potential through being flexible, right? If you have an electric vehicle, the average German drives something like 20-30 kilometers per day. That means you really only have to charge your EV once a week, or even less than that. So picking the right hours for that can mean you can basically charge your car for free. But if you take that incentive away, you never raise that potential for flexibilization on the retail side, which overall which in the long term will lead to a much more expensive system to run.
No, absolutely. Yeah, Amund. No.
Well, I just comment on that, because I remember one of the first things we were working on when we came into government in 2021 was this sort of demand flexible grid fee, which also became surprisingly to me very controversial. And you have, because there was a very mild proposal saying like you have one grid fee controlled for effect, and it will sort of like a staircase go up. And certain times of days it would be more expensive to charge your car, just as everyone is making their dinner. It would be incentivized doing it at night. And that became super controversial, and people were in the news with saying, like, what about grandma who has 15 sons coming to visit, charging their electric vehicles all at the same time while she's making dinner, and then she's faced with these huge grid fees the day after, which is sort of, it's very hard, I think, in the current political environment to communicate these things properly and not be misunderstood, either on purpose, which I think a lot of these people did, or accidentally. Which is why I think sort of you have to allow for some policy overreaction occasionally, simply because this sector is so ripe with misunderstanding out in the political sphere.
But it's also very complex, isn't it, Hans? I mean, this search for simplistic solutions in a very complex market is not always that helpful, is it?
No, it's not, and I think it's actually quite damaging, and that's why, maybe I'm not plugged in enough into the Norwegian political discussions, but in my view, Norway already had a well-designed mechanism to cap the effects of the highest power prices on consumers, right? I mean, there's a certain threshold above which 90%, I think it was, of the increase was refunded, and that's a way of not hurting consumers, but maintaining incentives to flexibilize demand. Right. So in a way, it was a well functioning system, but still it was scandalized in this way, and that's something for me, I guess, as an energy economist, that's quite hard to grasp. But then I guess I'm too much into the weeds there, and not enough into the politics.
But I think that's an important point, Hans. I mean, it is all about the details and the technicalities here. But let's turn to the German election. We've got the AfD now. Are they polling almost the second biggest party now? Are they
low 20s?
The low 20s. So that's quite substantial increase from previously. I think maybe it's safe to say that it's unlikely that there will be a party of government. Highly unlikely. But what are their kind of energy-related policies? I've heard the leader talking about tearing down windmills and maybe cutting off power exports. I mean, is this realistic? I mean,
the windmills of shame, she called it.
Really?
Yeah, it's a quite a difficult political situation we find ourselves in. And if you talk to, especially conservative politicians behind the scenes, I hear a lot of concerns that basically the next government has one shot to sort things out and fix the German economic model, and if they don't manage, we'll quite likely have an AfD-led government by 2029, which I think in the eyes of most Germans at this point in time would be quite a concerning development, especially because the German economic model isn't easy to fix, because it's really been hit by a perfect storm of the energy crisis, but also China's sluggish economic growth, more competition from China, trade barriers going up everywhere, especially in the US. So that has fundamentally challenged how Germany is doing its business, and sorting that out in a couple of years in a way that will be convincing to voters is a big challenge. So I am quite concerned there. On the energy policy side, to be honest, it's not very concrete, and it's also not very thought through, right? This tearing down windmills, I mean, that's something Alice Weidel, the main candidate for the AfD, said in one of her rally speeches, and then she said, then a couple of days later, when questioned about it, she said, "Oh no, I didn't mean all windmills. I only meant the windmills in that particular forest." And so,
yeah, okay.
so there's
a bit of backtracking.
Yeah,
as well,
there's a lot of populism, and I don't see an overarching energy concept, or energy policy which they would have and which they would implement.
I mean, I think that's a key area here. But isn't there a danger that some of the mainstream parties will react to that populism in a way and introduce populist measures, or that sort of rubs off, even though then they don't mean to go to those extremes? Isn't that a danger? I mean, this proposal from the Norwegian government is a little bit along those lines, isn't it, Amund? Isn't that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think it's fair to say that any political force has to react to voter movements, right? So I think there are a bunch of reasons why there's growth of populist parties in Europe. One is, of course, that there is some real grievance on sort of the cost of living. Things are more expensive, things are hard to explain, things are complex, and also established political parties has to respond to that movement of voters, right? But also, I think in general, I can very much agree with what's been said. I think that one of the big populist risks for energy is that it gets harder to do anything at all, right? Because you have much more parties on the outside of the sort of center consensus, where so center left, center right consensus has been European integration. It's good to do renewable energy. You should have interconnectors between the countries. You should have a rational system. And you should have a system that allows you to optimize all the resources, which then the flip side of that will be expensive occasionally. But I think the more parties you have outside of that consensus, the harder it is to get anything done. So I think interconnectors will be more difficult, market integration will be more difficult, explaining all the things will be more difficult. So if you're an energy player, I think the main concern would be, will you get the politicians to do difficult things? Because I think the key characteristic of populist parties is that they want to do easy things, and they want to simplify. They don't want to do complex things, and they don't want to do unpopular things. So the more they are, the more difficult it is to do energy business.
I mean, these are not easy or simple markets. Hanns, what's your view here?
Yeah, so I definitely see the danger of a popular response by the mainstream. However, I think there's also a more positive potential outcome, which is actually a rationalization of German energy policy in response to this challenge. Just to what do I mean by that? Just to give you one example. All of Germany's planning for the energy transition over the next couple of years is under the assumption of an electricity consumption of 750 terawatt hours in 2030. That's what all the renewables build out plans and so forth are geared towards. Last year we had something like 520, which means basically a 50% increase over 5 years, which even with all the AI and electrification and so forth, which we will see, is, according to our analyses, but also lots of others, very unlikely to happen, right? We're more likely to end up somewhere 600, 650. So it would actually be a rational thing to say, yes, let's continue building renewables and let's continue building them at a historically very high rate. But let's not build them at the rate that is currently foreseen, because that very likely gives us a system that is oversized for the amount of demand that we will actually have in the medium term. And that means, of course, well, if demand has to pay for the system, that means a very expensive system, right? Mm-hmm. So I do think there are steps of rationalization which mainstream politics can and should take without throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
I mean, that's a crucial point. Amund.
I agree with that point. I think that's one of the things that drives these populist parties is the sort of the slight inconsistencies and aggregations of classic centrist politics as well. Like you say, well, demand will grow with X amount, and then the populists say, well, no, it won't, and we're investing in this for no reason, and then you get in this discussion like who is right and who is wrong. So I think in general, a more rational approach to all of these targets would probably be beneficial for politics in general and make it easier to plan.
But I mean, the classic approach from these populistics, certainly on the right, I don't know about the left in Germany, but has been very much anti-wind, and in some parts of Europe as well, pro-nuclear. I mean, are we seeing more of the politicizations of the different kind of generation technologies, Hanns, here, do you think?
Yes, it's but that's not necessarily a very new development. So with wind, there's always been NIMBYism. I think in most countries, so that's nothing particularly new. But what's always been striking to me is the right's infatuation with nuclear. Also seems to be a fairly global phenomenon, not just in Germany. And of course, you can have a very long discussion about whether it was sensible to turn off Germany's nuclear reactors. I mean, from an emissions perspective and cost perspective, probably not. But that's an entirely different discussion to building new nuclear reactors. And usually very pro-market people will go out and say, oh, the state should spend tens of billions to build a huge fleet of new nuclear reactors, which in my view isn't all that consistent. But that is certainly also something that is coming from the right and also from the AfD, that we need new nuclear rather than building wind and so forth.
I'd like to bring the discussion back a little bit to what you were talking about here, Amund, about the interconnectedness and how important that is. But you know, there has been some criticism from Norway's neighbours with not just the fixed retail price, but also the cable discussions in Norway, when they're talking about maybe not renewing or hesitating to renew cables with Denmark. I mean, it sends signals to its neighbours that it's Norway first kind of policy, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, how has this been? How has the fixed retail price been? How has it been taken in Norway's neighbours?
I'd say very badly. It's not. I think that's kind of understandable. I think if you look at the retail price first, I think if you're Sweden and Norway implements a system that guarantees that Norwegian consumers will not be demand responsive, that's bad news. Like from a system perspective, but also from a price perspective. Right, so you can easily see that drive a price that's more clearly linked to the wholesale price further up in southern Sweden that would otherwise be the case. So I think for sure that there's controversy around it. But also I think that's one of the things that if the government's serious about doing this is one of the things that really should try to untangle. Also, I think there's a sad development on interconnectors both in Norway and for that matter in Sweden, who just recently rejected the TSO's proposal to build another cable to Germany. That there is, for in the markets that have a surplus of energy, the cables are controversial because the market coupling raises the price in that market. And I think that you can see around. You can see it sort of in various markets around, and I think that's a sad development. I think one of the most important things that got Europe through the crisis over the last couple of years was the interconnectedness, the fact that you could move power from Norway to Germany, you could move power from Germany to France when the nuclear capacity was down, and now that you can move power from the Nordics and from the middle of Europe into Ukraine when their system is under attack. Right? So I think that's clearly one of the most important facets by the system. But it's also controversial. And do I think it's generally the smoothest of plans of the Norwegian government to say we're not going to renew cables to Denmark in 2028, 2029 to fix a problem today? No, I don't really think so. But it is reflexive of particularly in Norway, the two last cables, the one to Germany and the one to UK, has been very controversial because it, over time, increased the capacity quite a lot. And those two markets have been very heavily hit by the energy crisis over the last couple of years. So that, but I would say not enough effort's been put into explaining it, but it's also been very difficult. So I think the fact that it kind of forces the government into a position where you have to say something to take some of the air out of that balloon. But I don't think it's in my personal opinion, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very short-termist, isn't it? Because in a long-term view, when you've got the UK or other parts of the world, we're building up massive offshore wind, that power is going to flow back and bring prices down as well.
It is, right? But I do think for a hydro-based system, there is a real thing to consider whether you are, through being sort of the producer of last resort in sort of Northern Europe outside of thermal power, you are basically paying balancing power prices in Germany for your baseload power in Norway, which is controversial. So I think that it's not a bad idea to think a little bit about how that can be done better and how the market can be set up better. But yeah, it's of course the case that the power might come the other way, but that's not today.
Yeah, I mean, Hanns, just to bring you in here as well, I mean, have cables been as controversial in Germany as well, or interconnectors?
I wouldn't say so. They certainly haven't hit that degree of politicization. However, we've also generally been, at least German consumers have been on the benefiting end from interconnection into Sweden, Norway, and so forth. But actually, 2 points on this one. First point. It may prove quite short-sighted to cut all these cables out, because it's not at all inconceivable for Norway to actually have a demand development that will make it cease being a net exporter and turn it into a net importer, right? With all the data centers, with hydrogen, with heavy industry relocating there, right? There's a lot of demand growth going on in Norway, and there may well be a world in 5 or 10 years where Norway is quite happy to be connected to the UK, to Germany, and so forth. I think the other point that's also under discussed in this context is that of course, whenever there's consumer prices go up, there's also producer surplus that's increasing, right? And actually, a lot of the producer surplus in the Nordic countries has gone to basically state-owned companies, right? So there would also be an option to actually redistribute some of those earnings back to consumers, without tinkering with the electricity market design at all.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, and we did the government. That's kind of what the government's doing, right? Is shifting the revenue both from the power companies and from the TSO bottleneck fees back into both the cap, the emergency mechanism, and also the proposed Norway price. But I do think it's interesting that one of the arguments from the Swedes of not doing the German, the new German cable, and one of the arguments I think from the Norwegian government currently on why you want to be hesitant in doing more integration is sort of the unstableness of the system, and the fact that Germany has just one price zone which kind of artificially increases the price. So I think it's an interesting parallel, not to sort of, we're in Germany, but I thought it's an interesting parallel to see the surplus energy countries doing to Germany what Germany did to the people needing cash during the financial crisis. So we need some form of structural reform to this in order to get it, which I think is a fascinating discussion.
I think on the German wholesale market zone, we're in complete agreement. I think we need the split for actually even all kinds of internal reasons, but also to stop causing issues for our neighboring countries. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just a final question really to you, Hanns, and this is about, we're in a week where Donald Trump has announced a slew of tariffs. What does this mean for Germany as the industrial heartland of Europe? And in particular, I see the steel industries come out saying this is a disaster for them, for example. What does it mean for Germany and its industry?
I mean, if this stays, of course, it's bad, and there's also a certain risk that this is only the beginning, right? The opening salvo in kind of a whole barrage of tariffs and protectionism. However, I guess the hope is, and I don't think that's inconceivable, is that there is a deal to be made. and there is a deal to be made around defense. I think most people in Europe now accept that we need to be paying for our own security, and we can't rely on American taxpayers fronting the bill for European security. So that could be part of a deal. I mean, what also was part of a deal last time Trump stepped tariffs on European exports is that we retaliated with some very well targeted tariffs, I think, against inter alia against whiskey. And actually within a couple of months there was a deal that led to the removal of all the tariffs. So I think there is hopefully also some deal making to be done there to reduce the negative effects. But yes, if they stay, it's bad.
Yeah. It's good to close on a little bit of optimism that it could just be the start of new negotiations. I like that, Hanns. So Hanns Koenig and Amund Vik, thank you very much for being guests on Plugged In. You've been listening to Plugged In, Montel's energy news podcast. Our episodes are released every Friday. For the latest news from Montel, please visit montelnews.com, and you can follow us on LinkedIn and X. I'm Richard Sverrisson. See you next time.